Hi, Rod Driver. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Thank you very much for having me on the show again.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure for us, obviously, because you're bringing reality to the proceedings, and I think that's one of the things that we really focus on, Rod. Is this attempt to try and bring facts, to bring information, to bring sourced information, excuse me, into the whole nature of the media, because I think the media is too obsessed with clickbait. It's too obsessed with just basically anything that gets people's attention. It has no real concern anymore whether it's fact-based. So you being on this show is wonderful for us, as in with many of our other guests too. So this week we're going to focus on what was called the Red Scare, but the nature of the hyperbole that surrounded the use of communism, as it was called, especially in America, and I suppose the essence of how beneficial it was to America holistically. So over to you.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. So this is the first of a number of different presentations that I'll be doing that talk about exaggerated threats and how governments, particularly Britain and America, use exaggerated threats to then justify doing all sorts of either foreign policies or domestic policies. So we're going to start with communism, and then at some point in the future, we'll probably discuss the exaggerated threat of terrorism, and then perhaps we'll discuss the exaggerated threat of weapons of mass destruction. But these are all things that we can learn a great deal from about the nature of propaganda in the West. Now, I came across an excellent quote from many years ago. This was actually by Hitler's second in command, Hermann Göring, who was an expert in propaganda. Now, it's a slightly long quote, but it's worth reading in full. Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. And I think that quote is a fantastic sort of summary of all the different types of exaggerated threats that have been used in the West. So if we do today communism, what we're focusing on is the period from after the Second World War in 1945 until 1989, when the Berlin Wall was brought down. So for the whole of that period, almost half a century, you have to remember that much of Eastern Europe was occupied by Russian occupation. We call this region the Soviet Union. And the American and British politicians, broadcasters, and propagandists used the presence of the Soviet Union to create fear in the minds of the populations in Britain and America. And so they were forever telling us that at any moment we might be attacked by the Soviet Union, who would then impose a communist system upon us. And there was immense propaganda. So I remember as a child that there were what were called public information films, where we were always taught that in the event of a nuclear attack, we have to shelter under a table, and you could actually buy fallout shelters to put in the garden and so on. And then there was a more general type of propaganda about what is wrong with communism. And you could actually see posters with slogans like "better dead than red," where red was the term meaning communist, and other expressions saying communism saps free will, and things like this. And this was everywhere. Now, we know since that time, looking at the declassified files and various other sources of information, that this was always exaggerated. So, for example, our broadcasters were forever telling us that there's something they called a bomber gap or a missile gap. This meant that the Russians had more military bombers or more missiles than we had. And therefore we have to invest in more aeroplanes, more bombers, and more missiles to defend ourselves. Well, Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense in the 1960s in the United States, admitted that this was always exaggerated in order to increase the US military budget. And in fact, the data has shown quite clearly that these gaps were always the other way around, that America always had, right up until a very small period later on, many more missiles and bombers than Russia had. And there was a very big investigation in the US Congress in the late 70s and early 80s, showing that the threat of communism was exaggerated over and over again by intelligence services and other branches of the military to justify their foreign policies. And we'll talk a little bit more about the policies that they were working on overseas and what they were using the propaganda to do in a minute. And one commentator at the time, behind the scenes, again, we've seen this from the declassified files, said, the most critical special operations mission we have today is to persuade the American people that the communists are out to get us. And so the idea was that any country that had a communist government was considered to be part of a great big communist plot to take over the world. Well, the evidence indicates very clearly that many left-wing governments were not agents of Russia. They were actually governments that wanted to run themselves independently. And on many occasions, they turned to Russia for help when they were threatened by the United States. So some writers have suggested that a better way to think of the system was what was known as spheres of influence. So Russia was free to dominate within the Soviet Union, and America was free to dominate outside the Soviet Union, so in most of the world. And that description holds reasonably well for most of the period. But there were countries where both nations, both Russia and America, did interfere at different times. So if we look at what America's true motive was throughout this period, it was trying to block independent development. Now, I've talked about this in a previous presentation, that what America wants is to control the resources and the trading opportunities of every country in the world, if it possibly can. And so it doesn't want a poor country to come along and show that it is possible to run a successful economy without American companies dominating its industries. So Cuba is the sort of shining example of a country that's actually survived despite a great deal of American pressure and American attempts to overthrow the government there and to strangle its economy through sanctions and so on. And Cuba demonstrates that it is perfectly possible to give everyone in your country a reasonable quality of life without having to allow American companies to dominate your industries. So America was worried about what it called the domino effect. If one country can set a good example and show how you can operate independently, other countries might follow. And so what it wanted to do was commit all sorts of violent atrocities in those countries that were attempting to develop independently. So there are a number of examples of this. There was a very famous series of events which were called Operation Condor, where the CIA, that's America's intelligence agency, led the way in training torturers and murderers throughout parts of South America. So throughout the 1970s, there were death squads and torture squads. And although the nations and those torture squads and death squads operated to some extent independently, the CIA led them in training them and explaining how to rule your country through repression. Left-wing academics, left-wing journalists, and left-wing politicians. So it was right-wing leaders who were trying to suppress any attempts by left-wing leaders to enable the poor to have more control over their lives. And this type of thing was repeated a little under Ronald Reagan in America in the 1980s, and in Nicaragua, Grenada, El Salvador, America intervened militarily to help right-wing governments suppress left-wing governments, killed lots of people, and supported very, very violent leaderships. Now, this is all quite relevant to today because from 2018 onwards, America decided that to change its overall foreign policy focus away from dealing with terrorism, and we'll talk about that in detail in another session, but to focus more on what it calls strategic opposition. So that would mean the rise to power of Russia and China and local powerful countries such as Iran. And so there is a great deal of propaganda in the last few years, which is saying, oh, these nasty, nasty Russians. So we get Russiagate, which is supposed Russians hacking into American elections. We get China supposedly spying on us through their phone systems and our IT systems, and so on. And it's all American hype. Now, that's not to say that the Russian government and or the Chinese government will never do anything wrong, but it's to say that actually anything they do compared to what America already does is just a drop in the ocean. Far and away, the American government is by far the biggest criminal organization doing these things. I actually came across a wonderful joke when I was researching all of these things about communism, and it was this. The communists rapidly discovered that everything their communist leaders had taught them about communism was a lie. However, as soon as they experienced capitalism, they rapidly discovered that everything their communist leaders had taught them about capitalism was true. And I think this is a wonderful way of saying any form of extreme system, whether it's an extreme form of communism or extreme form of capitalism, probably is not that great a system to be living under. So that's the main summary. Now, I think there's a number of interesting talking points that we could discuss, Jason. So I'll throw it back to you, and we can take the conversation in whatever direction you would like to.
Yeah, and there's so many, as usual, there's so many things flying across my mind, but you can't cover them all. So I'll try and sort of edit them down a little bit. I suspect that it's just an accepted norm now from the Russian angle that the West will invent stories or use hyperbole in order to increase the fear factor, increase the scare factor. And I also suspect that they've done exactly the same in the same time period, the other way around. So I think it's probably water off a duck's back now. I mean, if we look at, for example, the Salisbury poisoning. Now, we don't know the facts. We're only told the information that we're given by the state and the corporate media, who generally are acting on behalf of the state. So we don't know if it's 100% true, 10% true, or what it is. And we also do know that because we don't trust the state and we don't trust the propaganda machine, it leaves a massive vacuum. And that vacuum is then filled by multiple interpretations and multiple theories, some of which may become quite a threat to the establishment, and therefore they're quickly named conspiracy theories. So I think we have to be aware of, as I say, that both sides are guilty of this, and that there's a lot of things that are introduced into the public arena, public sphere, that we should seriously question. But the problem is that it's getting access to the information that would firm up some of the hypotheses that exist, and that makes it very, very difficult.
Well, I think that's a really good point. So, in fact, a number of really good points. So, the first thing that other governments do this too is sort of widely recognized. And it's very, very interesting that if you talk to people from Russia, or if you talk to people from almost any other country, then they are aware that their own government does propaganda. And I think one of the interesting things is, I can't be sure about this because I don't speak Chinese and I don't speak Russian and I don't watch their media for hours a day. So I can't be an expert on analyzing their propaganda. But I think it's probably the case that in other countries, more people are reasonably aware that what their governments are saying might be propaganda. Whereas I suspect in countries like Britain and America, the awareness that people are being bombarded by propaganda by organizations such as the BBC, which are widely trusted, there's probably less general awareness. I think there's a kind of subset of the population who, once they've been switched on to what's going on, then suddenly it becomes glaringly obvious that we are being bombarded by propaganda. But until somebody kind of introduces you to the topic, everybody who's sort of brought up in an ordinary family in Britain or America kind of buys into the mainstream. And I know I did until I was about 35. It never occurred to me that a great deal of what I was reading in newspapers or watching on mainstream television was a highly distorted version of events. And yet once you start reading sort of critiques and start thinking about it, then it starts to become obvious. But until that sort of switch is flicked, then it's very tricky to sort of work it out for yourself. You kind of think that the story doesn't quite make sense. You know there's inconsistencies. You know that when Britain or America are dropping bombs all over other countries and they're saying, hey, we're the good guys, we're out to save the world. You're going, well, hang on a minute, I'm a bit skeptical. So there's always that at the back of your mind, but it's really hard to actually make the leap to understand how the whole thing works. And then when you mentioned the Salisbury poisonings, I thought that was very interesting because there's the former British ambassador, Craig Murray, who sadly has been locked up in Scotland for the time being. He wrote a great deal about the Salisbury poisonings. And whilst he doesn't claim any more than anybody else to know what actually went on and the detail of what's happening, he pointed out so many really serious flaws in the mainstream narrative that you realize it just doesn't make sense. Yeah. And so this is what I find with more and more things, that whilst I can't claim to know the full detail of what happened in Ukraine or any other major series of events, it doesn't take that long to work out that the mainstream narrative is fairly evidently not true in a lot of situations. And so you just sort of wonder about what is the full extent. And you can do as much research as you possibly can, but there will always be many unknowns about these circumstances unless a very high-ranking insider, probably some years down the line writing their memoirs, decides to come clean and tell us what really goes on.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely it. It hits the nail on the head in that, we can go down the road as far as we possibly want, but the chances are that no matter how far we go down that road, it's never going to be far enough in terms of understanding the truth, the reality. And it's almost like, I think of it sometimes, it's just coming to my head now, it's a bit like a hole in the ground, a dark hole in the ground. And you don't know what's in the hole. It could be Aladdin's lamp. It could be a family of rattlesnakes. So in the end, what you don't do is put your hand down the hole. And that's, I think, one of our failings. So many people don't even start the process of investigation. They just either simply accept what they're being told, or they think it's too dangerous.
Well, I think that's a really good point, actually. In fact, later on, I hope we'll have a serious discussion about human psychology. But this business about fearing, discovering information that contradicts a very comfortable, cozy worldview that most people have of life in Britain and America, and the British and American governments being perfectly reasonable. And so they don't want to upset that because they know they will feel uncomfortable. And one of the interesting things I found about talking to people about British and American war crimes and about propaganda and talking to people face to face is that I find people split reasonably evenly into two camps. Those that are either really fascinated by it and really want to understand it, and the other camp is people who just do not want to know. they are so frightened of hearing what's really going on and discovering it's a very, very negative, dark world that we actually inhabit, that they prefer not to go there. They just want to carry on with their regular lives and hope that it doesn't affect them too seriously.
But I think there's also, I believe there's also a third explanation, Rod, and I think that a lot of it is to do with also that a lot of people haven't got the skills and the understanding and the knowledge to go there. And because they've already formulated a hypothesis in their minds, it's probably they've had for a fair amount of time, it's become like dry concrete, it's become fixed. So what tends to happen is that they feel that if an academic comes along, for example, and tries to enlighten them, tries to put them right, especially via social media. But if someone who appears to know more than they do, their lives are already about being on the defensive. They're already about feeling insecure with themselves and feeling inferior. So this sort of almost reinforces that feeling of inferiority. When someone comes along and says everything that you've believed up until now is mostly wrong.
I think there's an element of truth in that. I think that's right. And in fact, again, we might talk about this in psychology, that in fact, attempts to debunk what people already believe usually fail. And there's more and more evidence coming out that often attempts to debunk misinformation end up reinforcing people's beliefs in the wrong direction. So this is clearly a complex area that's going to need quite a lot of research.
Yes.
And for people like us, we're going to have to one day hope we understand these things, in that it becomes very, very difficult to get people to change their minds. As you say, once they hold a firmly held opinion, as you say, like it's set in concrete and so on. So one of the things that you've mentioned in the past when we're talking about communism, and I think this is quite important in relation to tonight's presentation, is what governments do at home when they've got an exaggerated threat that they can use. And you've mentioned in the past the sort of Red Scare and McCarthyism in America in relation to this. So why don't you just sort of summarize the sort of McCarthy situation in a few sentences, just for people who are not very familiar with what happened in America back in the 50s?
Yeah, McCarthy was the senator who believed that there was a communist threat within America, and that it was becoming more and more powerful, and unless that he and others stood up against it, it could threaten the American way of life. So what he sought to do was to create folk devils of these people and make the American public generally turn against them. And he managed to, get on board quite not profound, but quite popular personalities within American culture, actors, etc., who, people like John Wayne, for example, who were prepared to name and shame. And this created this massive conflict, for example, in Hollywood, this massive division. But at the same time, he created this legal jurisprudence situation where people could actually be on show trials, which is ironic, given that that was very much part of the Stalinist totalitarian perspective as well, to stick people into show trials, to find them guilty and to make them disappear. Obviously, it wasn't quite as radical as that in America, but what it was doing, it was preventing people from having jobs. It was leading to people getting sacked. It was leading people to getting isolated, to have bricks thrown through their window, white feathers put through their letterbox. This whole idea that these people were a threat to the American way of life. However, what McCarthy didn't expect was that very significant people thought he was completely a rotten apple. He was undermining American liberties, undermining the American Constitution, and eventually it tipped. And McCarthy and all his sympathizers, effectively, they became the ones that were the folk devils.
Yeah, so I think it's a fascinating example from history of how witch hunts can get started under the certain circumstances. And if you exaggerate threats, if you go right back to the original witch hunts where people were actually believed to be witches, and the whole thing was completely fake, to my knowledge, there have never been any witches actually discovered in England or anywhere else. And yet large numbers of people were murdered because of these beliefs put about by propaganda. And I think the sort of McCarthyite witch hunts were a great modern day example of this. And I think it's important that we try and learn the lessons of history, in that it's very, very easy for people to be taken in by a charlatan who, if he's putting out the right messages at the right times and the right threats at the right times and exaggerating the right threats at the right times, then people can be tricked into believing all sorts of nonsense. And so my advice to everybody all the time, whatever I'm talking about, is to learn to question everything. And that applies across the board to every topic you ever study, to question everything. And it doesn't matter what source it comes from, that actually you need to be capable of thinking for yourself about everything. And once people get used to questioning everything and to trying to think for themselves and to so on and so on, then I think it's much easier for people to sort of work out what's going on. And if you don't sort of take on board this idea that you must question everything, then we all receive information about a million different topics all the time. You're always going to believe some of them, and some of them will be put out by government press releases or corporate press releases, and some of them may not be true. And so we need to be really questioning about everything we hear. And the communist threat was a sort of great example of this.
Yeah, and I think there's just two things to finish off, Rod. I mean, firstly, we need an education system and a culture that promotes the idea of questioning, which I don't think we have. I think our education system, certainly up to the age of 16, is about closing things down, about still having this authority figure who provides the knowledge or provides the places you look for knowledge, and everybody else is supposed to just sit there and consume it like a sponge. And as much as we might argue that education has changed, it certainly hasn't changed anywhere near enough for young people to start understanding that questioning everything and finding out accurate information is more important than almost anything. But the other thing to finish off with, and I think this is probably a little bit more controversial, I suspect, is the whole essence of the word communism. Because for many writers, political theorists, philosophers, there was no such thing in practical terms as communism in the Soviet bloc, in China, in anywhere, North Korea. I mean, there's places that possibly have come closer than others, but in essence, there are a lot of economists as well. They all argue that it was much closer to state capitalism than it ever was to this term that was coined communism. And the reason that communism became this linguistic, semantic, symbiotic term is ultimately because neither side questioned it. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, the perception that they wanted to give out was of success, that they've achieved what they wanted to achieve, because there was always the big threat of capitalism. And therefore, you then have these two blocks. And the capitalist bloc, in turn, was saying, hey, we're the best. And if you don't believe we're the best, look over there at how bad communism is. So instead of the Soviet bloc and Russian leaders saying, hang on, we're not communist. We might be heading that way. We might get there within the next 150, 200 years. But if you read Marx, it's a process. But they never did that. They refer to themselves as communists. So they undermine the whole essence of what philosophers believe communism to be. And the mass population of the planet just use that word unthinkingly. And I think that's become one of the absolute major issues, major problems, is that people are referring to something that actually never existed in practice.
I think that's a really good point, actually. And you know, the strange thing is, I try and avoid getting bogged down in complex conversations about what communism should be and what different states at different points in time have actually achieved. And I actually find that almost every word that ends in ism, so socialism, capitalism, and to a slightly lesser extent, neoliberalism, gets used in so many different ways by so many different people. And you see people starting to have a debate about these things, and you realize they're slightly talking across each other.
Yes.
They're using the terms to mean different things.
Yes.
And later on, perhaps we might be talking about, say, capitalism and market economies. And suddenly you start to realize people use these terms interchangeably, and then other people are using them in much more specific ways. And so I tend to find that with all of these discussions, if you want to have a serious discussion about it, you have to sort of put the big word to one side, define what it is you'd like to have a conversation about,
yes,
make sure everyone in the room is agreed on what you're talking about,
yes,
and then kind of go from there.
That is, and that's a brilliant place to finish, because I think that needs to be the way in which social media goes forward. It almost needs to, when you post something, you almost need to, you know, the key word in the sentence, you ought to say, this is what it means to me. So you can have a discussion, if you like, about what it means to you before you even debate any other aspect of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I hope actually, as part of the later sort of series of presentations that we'll do and the discussions that we'll have, we'll talk a little bit about economics, not in any technical sense, just in terms of, well, basically how corrupt the political system in Britain and America and much of the West has become. And I use the term neoliberalism to mean a very kind of specific sets of laws and goals that big companies have, that it's basically about the power of big business and so on. So we'll have a nice example of that later on, I hope.
Brilliant. Thank you so much again, Rod, for coming on 10 by 6. Really appreciate it, and a wonderful and a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much.